Mr. President, my November briefing on the Syrian crisis focused on the constraints and challenges to humanitarian access across conflict lines inside Syria and across borders into Syria. In this month's briefing, I would like to focus on issues related to the protection of civilians in Syria following the adoption of Resolution 2139 in February this year. The resolution was unanimously adopted in recognition of the magnitude of the human cost this conflict carries. The intention of the resolution was to seek protection for civilians caught in the midst of the fighting and to ensure that civilian facilities and infrastructure, for example, hospitals and schools, were not attacked. The Security Council demanded that the parties to the conflict take immediate action to end the relentless violence and stop all violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, I regret to inform the Council that 10 months later, the Council's strong demands have gone unheard. The parties to the conflict continue to ignore the most basic principles of humanity. In many parts of Syria, the level of violence has worsened, with civilians continuing to pay heavily with loss of life, serious injuries, psychological trauma, ongoing and recurring displacement, and massive damage to property and infrastructure. In February, it was estimated that 100,000 people had been killed. Today, the UN estimates that number is closer to 200,000, with around 1 million people injured, and the numbers increase daily. Some 12.2 million Syrians now require humanitarian assistance, an increase of 2.9 million people in only 10 months. Almost half of the Syrian population is displaced, with more than 7.6 million IDPs and well over 3 million refugees in neighboring countries, a fifth of the number of people displaced worldwide. Mr. President, every time we use a new figure in relation to the Syrian crisis, we say that it is unprecedented. We have run out of words to fully explain the brutality, violence, and callous disregard for human life, which is a hallmark of this crisis. The international community has become numb to its impact with the vast numbers, regional reach, and sense of political impasse. Mr. President, the Council made a number of specific calls in Resolution 2139. A call for the end to the indiscriminate use of weapons. However, all parties to the conflict continue to violate this most basic of laws with devastating consequences. The government has continued to use barrel bombs in densely populated areas, killing and maiming people. The use of barrel bombs has been particularly acute in Aleppo, Hama, Idlib, rural Damascus, Deir ez-Zor, Ruqa, and Dara. In the first 5 months following Resolution 2139, Human Rights Watch documented over 650 major new damaged sites, consistent with the use of barrel bombs on neighborhoods in the city of Aleppo alone. Armed opposition groups and designated terrorist organizations have also used explosive weapons, including mortars and car bombs, in populated areas, killing civilians. Resolution 2139 explicitly condemns grave violations and abuses committed against children and condemns all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Yet today, Syria is one of the most dangerous places on earth to be a child. In February, around 4 million children were particularly vulnerable and in need of international assistance. Today, over 5.6 million children are in need of immediate assistance. Children have been murdered, tortured, and subjected to sexual violence by all parties to the conflict. Reports of children killed or publicly executed, crucified, beheaded, and stoned to death, particularly by ISIL, have increased in recent months. Millions of children have been traumatized by the horrors they have been forced to witness. We have also seen a trend of children receiving military training and weapons, being used in combat roles, younger and younger. Reports have been received of 350 children, some as young as 5 years old, being trained for combat in a military camp in Ruqa. As I have reported on many occasions, this conflict is not only shattering Syria's present, it is also destroying its future. Reports of sexual and gender-based violence have increased since July, particularly but not exclusively perpetrated by ISIL. Recently, Kurdish refugees from Kobani reported the capture of young girls by ISIL for sexual purposes, girls as young as 12. Reports of early and forced marriage are also on the rise. This is in part due to a depletion of family resources, and more recently because parents are terrified of their unmarried daughters being forced to marry ISIL fighters in areas under their control. Women captured as slaves by ISIL have been sold in markets in Ruqa. Some are sold to individual men, others are kept by ISIL in rest houses and face multiple rapes by fighters returning from the battlefield. As noted by the Commission of Inquiry, ISIL has carried out mass victimization of civilians, including murder, enslavement, rape, forcible displacement and torture, and has violated its obligations towards civilians and persons order combat amounting to war crimes. In Resolution 2139, the Security Council demanded the immediate end to the practice of arbitrarily denying people and the use of torture in detention centres. Despite this, tens of thousands of civilians continue to be arbitrarily detained and subjected to systematic and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment and torture. The majority are males taken at checkpoints or during ground raids. The Commission of Inquiry continues to receive reports of serious torture and beatings in government detention facilities. Detainees are often held in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions without adequate food, water, and healthcare. Reports of detainees dying from torture and malnutrition continue. The Commission has also reported on armed opposition groups taking people hostage, including women and children. People are held under conditions that constitute cruel, inhuman, or degraded treatment or punishment. Mr. President, in Resolution 2139, the Security Council demanded that all parties respect the principle of medical neutrality and desist from attacks against civilian objects. Despite this call, the deliberate and indiscriminate damage to essential services, including hospitals, schools, and infrastructure, have become a regular occurrence. In the last 10 months, accounts of damage to water systems and electricity have continued to be reported, with large parts of cities cut off from receipt of basic services. Hospitals across the country have been attacked. Between the adoption of the resolution and the end of November, Physicians for Human Rights has documented 70 attacks on medical facilities, 60 of them by government forces. In the same period, 150 deaths of medical personnel were reported, 97 of them killed in the line of duty. The passage of medical assistance to hard-to-reach locations continues to be hindered by the lack of approvals from the government of Syria. Opposition groups have also prevented medical supplies from reaching besieged communities in Nubul and Zara. The government continues to withdraw medicines, medical equipment and supplies, including for surgical interventions, such as antibiotics and injectable medicines from UN convoys. Hospitals continue to be militarized by the parties to the conflict. Schools, which should be safe places for children to learn and grow, have been bombed from the air, subjected to mortar fire, and been attacked with car bombs. In the last 9 months, the UN has verified at least 35 attacks on or near schools, killing over 105 children. The actual number of schools attacked is likely to be higher. And parties to the conflict continue to use siege as a weapon of war, deliberately denying people access to basic assistance such as food and medicines. At the passing of Resolution 2139 in February, there were 220,000 people besieged by either government or opposition forces. 212,000 remain besieged today. 185,500 people by government forces and 26,500 people by opposition forces. Many of these communities have been besieged for years. No one allowed out, no aid allowed in for years. And there is now a new tactic, as we have seen in Yarmouk. Tiny amounts of aid allowed in, giving people hope, but so little it can only help a fraction of those in need. People's hopes raised and then dashed, time and time again. Despite the Security Council's continued call to lift the sieges, only 2 locations have seen an end to such practices: Hom's Old City and Moadamia. The UN and its partners have only been allowed to deliver to an average of 5% of people besieged each month with food and medicine since Resolution 2139 was passed. Mr. President, even in war there are rules. Denial of medical assistance or the use of starvation as a weapon of war is prohibited by international law. In February, I appealed to the Council to use its influence on parties to protect civilians and demand greater humanitarian access. In adopting Resolution 2139, this Council committed itself and the wider international community to the well-being and the protection of the people of Syria. Today, I appeal again to Council members to ensure that the parties heed its call and comply with Resolution 2139 in its entirety, to end the indiscriminate use of weapons in populated areas. This practice is responsible for a large proportion of the growing casualties. It is disproportionate and a violation of international law. To protect children from the wide range of violations they are subject to, parties to the conflict can make a clear direction to those who fight that committing crimes against children is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. To lift the sieges and allow people access to assistance essential to their survival. To facilitate unhindered humanitarian access, including for medical assistance, and respect the neutrality of medical facilities. This is expressly outlined as a basic premise of the Geneva Conventions. To hold the parties to account and end the pervasive climate of impunity. And most importantly, this Council and the international community must find a political end to this conflict, once and for all. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame.
I thank Ms. Amos for her briefing. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.
أبت وكيلة الأمين العام لشؤون الإغاثة الإنسانية فاليري آموس إلا أن تختم ولايتها في الأمم المتحدة بمزيد من التضليل، بمزيد من الكذب، بمزيد من النفاق، بمزيد من ذرف دموع التماسيح على ما يجري في سوريا. اليوم كانت فضائحية بامتياز في أدائها، لا أخلاقية بامتياز في تعليقاتها، مضللة بامتياز في معلوماتها التي قدمتها إلى أعضاء مجلس الأمن. يبدو أن هذه السيدة ما زالت تتبع أجندتها الخاصة، وعني بذلك أجندة الدبلوماسية البريطانية، بدلا من أن تطبق دبلوماسية وأجندة الأمم المتحدة. هي الحقيقة انتقائية طبعا في كل ما قدمته من معلومات وأرقام، وانتقائية مع الكذب والتضليل والنفاق كما قلنا. هي لم تذكر جبهة النصرة مثلا في كل بيانها، قدمت أرقام مغلوطة بالمطلق فيما يتعلق بالمناطق المحاصرة في سوريا. سعت بكل ما أوتيت من قوة إلى تحميل المسؤولية للحكومة السورية في تدمير المشافي والمدارس والاستهداف الجهاز الطبي والأطفال والنساء، وكأنها لا تقرأ شيئا من تقارير زميلاتها المبعوثات الخاصات لشؤون الأطفال في النزاعات المسلحة والعنف الجنسي. هذه السيدة غير واقعية، تحلق في فضاء غير ذي صلة بالأمم المتحدة، كاذبة من الطراز الرفيع، خطرة جدا لأنها تدفع أعضاء مجلس الأمن في اتجاهات لا علاقة لها بتطبيق قرارات مجلس الأمن 2170 2178 و2139 و2165 و2133. يعني هذه السيدة الحقيقة خطرة ليس فقط على سوريا، هي خطرة على الموضوع الإنساني الذي اؤتمنت عليه في الأمم المتحدة.
لكنها أوصت في النهاية بأن يكون هناك حل سلمي سريع، وإلا فإن سوريا مهددة في مستقبلها.
هي هذا ما تتمناه، هذا بالإنجليزي اسمه wishful thinking. هي تتمنى ذلك، ولذلك إذا لاحظت هي طرحت إحاطتها اليوم تحت عنوان حماية المدنيين، وكأنها طبعا يعني مش لم تتعلم شيئا من تجربة ليبيا، لا هي طبعا كانت ضليعة وضالعة في تجربة ليبيا، لأن القرار 1973 اعتمد تحت عنوان حماية المدنيين الليبيين كما تذكر، وحماية المدنيين الليبيين أدت إلى تدمير ليبيا وقتل الشعب الليبي بكامله. فهي تعرف ماذا تفعل، هي تستخدم دورها ووظيفتها لغايات خطرة جدا. هي تريد أن تعطي مصداقية للطرح التركي والفرنسي بموضوع المناطق العازلة ومناطق الحظر الجوي تحت ستار حماية المدنيين. لكن طبعا هذا الأمر يعني من رابع المستحيلات في أذهان الكثير من أعضاء مجلس الأمن، ممن أدركوا اليوم بعد 4 سنوات من الأزمة أن كل ما قالته لهم هذه السيدة كان كذبا ونفاقا ووبالا على العمل الإنساني في سوريا. هي تباكت على أوضاع المدنيين من أطفال ونساء ومشافي ومدارس، لكنها لم تقل من هو السبب. تباكت على أوضاع الشعب المدنيين السوريين والشعب السوري، وقالت أن هناك ملايين من النازحين واللاجئين، لكنها لم تشر إلى تأثير ما يسمى بالعقوبات الأمريكية والاتحاد الأوروبي وبعض العربان على الشعب السوري. هي تباكت على الوضع السوري، لكن لم تقل من الذي دمر المشافي والمدارس وقتل الأطفال في حمص، التفجيرات التي قامت بها الجماعات الإرهابية في حمص وقتلت العشرات من الأطفال. يعني هذه السيدة الحقيقة يعني كما قلت لا صلة لها بالواقع وخطرة وإلى درجة الإجرام.
بالنسبة للحصار تحدثت عن 27,000 محاصرين من قبل المعارضة، ما سمتهم بالمعارضة. هل هناك صحة لهذه الأرقام؟
لا هي هذه الأرقام كما قلت يعني ليس فقط الأرقام، هي الأسماء والأرقام والحروف والأبجدية كلها عندها غلط، تستخدم كل ذلك بطريقة خاطئة وبطريقة تستهدف الأضرار بالحكومة السورية وتضليل أعضاء مجلس الأمن. يعني هي عندما تقول بأن هناك 27,500 مدني سوري محاصرين من قبل الجماعات المسلحة، تصفهم هي بالجماعات المعارضة المسلحة، هي لا تقول أن جبهة النصرة ولا تقول داعش ولا تقول حركة كذا وألوية كذا، وهي كلها جماعات إرهابية مرتبطة بالقاعدة في النهاية، وتتلاعب بها أجهزة الاستخبارات القطرية والسعودية والتركية، لكنها لا تسميهم بهذا الاسم، تسميهم مجموعات مسلحة معارضة سورية. المهم في الأمر أنه 27,500 شخص محاصرين طلع معها في كل سوريا من قبل المعارضة، ما تصفهم بالمعارضة. طيب نبل والزهراء وحدهما عدد سكانهما يتجاوز 80,000. من الذي يحاصر نبل والزهراء؟ علما أنها ذكرت الاسم في إحاطتها، ذكرت نبل والزهراء. فهذا مثل بسيط الحقيقة على مدى نفاقها وكذبها وتضليلها الذي يرقى إلى درجة الإجرام. شكرا.